Professor Norman K. Thurston received his PhD from Princeton University, as well as a master's degree in economics. He specializes in healthcare economics and policy, public sector economics, labor economics and policy, and economic problems in Latin America, specifically Argentina, for which he will be discussing today. He received several fellowships, including the Princeton University Fellowship and the National Science Foundation Graduate Fellowship. Also was a Fulbright Scholar to Argentina in 2001. Prior to being an assistant professor of economics at Brigham Young University, he was a visiting professor and researcher at Universidad Nacional de La Plata in Argentina, as well as a visiting researcher and collaborating researcher at the Universidad Austral in Rosario, Argentina. He has numerous publications and has done extensive work on these areas of specialty. Today we are pleased to have him address the household behavioral in the presence of economic crisis, evidence from Argentina. Please welcome Professor Thurston.
Now, this is an interesting presentation because I have to not only overcome many of your biases against economic way of thinking, but I also have to present that in a way that you can learn something. So it's going to be a challenge for me, but I think that we'll have an interesting time. The topic that we're going to talk about today has to do with how do households react to economic crisis. What's puzzling about this is that we really don't know. Part of the reason why we really don't know is because you seldom have the opportunity to observe households in what we would consider true economic crisis. So in the U.S., for example, we have had studies that look at how households react to unemployment, but unemployment in the U.S., in recent times anyway, is not synonymous with economic crisis. And most of you would agree that if you have a family member who loses a job, you would hardly consider that household as being part of some sort of economic crisis. If you go back in time to the Great Depression, however, there were a lot of households who were in what we would consider true economic crisis. Unfortunately, the beginnings of economics were such that no one really thought to ask or to measure how households would react to this. So we can't really know from the past how people would react because no one thought to measure it. We have an interesting opportunity here because Argentina, I would say, is in a fair bit of economic crisis. And because our awareness of the problem is a little more developed than it would have been 70 or 80 years ago, we have the opportunity of actually going out and observing what is happening in terms of household behavior in economic crisis. So let me just go through, let me just tell you a little bit about their economic crisis. Now, some of you we've had a panel discussion of this not too long ago, and we had another speaker who's spoken on this, so I'm not going to go into great detail, but let me just review some of the hallmarks of the Argentine economic crisis. Now, they have had a pronounced recession that's been going on since 1998, so if you're counting, that's almost 5 years. A 5-year recession is actually a long time for any economy to be in recession, but it got significantly worse in 2001. Here are some of the things that happened. GDP has declined 25% since 1998. Those of you who are not familiar, GDP is a measure of the total productivity of the nation. So they are producing as a nation 25% less in 2001 than they were in 1998. So that's a pretty big decline. Normally, GDP grows over time, and so the fact that it's declining at all is a problem, but that it would decline by that much is a significant problem. An example of that is construction activity. Construction activity has decreased by 42% just in 1 year. So however you think of construction activity in the U.S., they have slightly different measures there, but think of new housing starts. New housing starts, imagine that if in 1 year, from 1 year to the next, new housing starts fell by almost half. So what's going to happen to all of the construction workers, which is a significant component of the economy, and you can see why this is a problem. There's an unemployment rate of around 21%, just to give you some idea of how bad that is. During the Depression in the U.S., the unemployment rate was about 25%. So not too different than things that we will have experienced in the U.S. during our economic crises. Poverty rate is up to 53%. Now that's kind of subjective. So if you think about, well, what does a poverty rate really mean? Well, every country kind of establishes their own. But 53% of the country is below the poverty rate that Argentina has declared official. The important thing to notice there is that it's up from 38% in 2001. This is from 2001 to 2002. So by whatever standards you're measuring it, there is a significant movement of people from positions of resources to poverty. The banking restrictions, which I hope that most of you are familiar with, I'm not going to really talk much about those. I'll talk about them briefly in a moment. There was a banking restriction that was put into place a little over a year ago called the Corralito. Basically, the federal government, in an attempt to prevent bank runs, froze everyone's assets. So if you had money in the bank, your money stayed in the bank. So think about that, what that would mean to you personally, that if you could not take any of your money out of your savings or checking account, how much problem would that cause for you? That in itself is not the problem. The problem is, of course, the instability of the banking system, but one of the ways we measure that is by looking at how that impacts individuals. And then, of course, currency devaluation. The peso used to be worth $1 per peso. It's now fallen to about, well, it depends on the day, but it's about 3.5 pesos to the dollar. So the peso has fallen by a significant amount. Here's how we're going to study this problem. This is kind of maybe good to go through our methodology so that you understand how economists approach this problem. And what we're going to do is we're going to use survey data to gauge how households have reacted to the economic crisis. So the important thing here is that we're relying on survey data. There are problems with survey data, but when it comes right down to it, you really don't have much other choice. So what we will try to do is use survey data to the best possible extent that survey data can be used. What we're going to use it for is to measure the impact of the crisis on each household. So we'll measure each household's behavior, household by household, and try to see how the economic crisis has affected their behavior. Then we're going to, within that subset of behaviors, we're going to identify coping strategies, and I'll explain those more in a minute, that we are interested in how households cope with economic stress. And then, of course, what we always want to do at the end of the day when you're using survey data is look for statistical relationships. Is there some sort of interesting statistical relationship between economic crisis and coping strategies? And as you will see, there are some very strong relationships. Let me tell you about the survey. The survey was conducted, was funded by the World Bank. It was conducted from June to July of 2002. There were over 3,000 households that were surveyed, but only 2,800. And it's kind of amazing. People say, do you mean exactly? It's surprising, but sometimes these things do end up in round numbers. There were exactly 2,800 households that completed the questionnaire. But this is an interesting survey because usually in Argentina when surveys are conducted, they go to the Buenos Aires suburban region and they just base their survey on Buenos Aires. Now, of course, if you look at the map, you can see that Buenos Aires on that map would be about the size of a pencil eraser. And there's a whole lot of other parts of the country to be interested in. So this survey was an important feature of it was it was nationally representative. Not only was it urban centers, but also rural centers as well. We collected in the survey demographic and socioeconomic information on each individual. So every individual in the household, we asked them, are they working? If they are, how much do they make? Interesting questions about their demographic and socioeconomic situation. We also asked them about household behavior. And again, we'll talk about these in a minute. Some of the things that we had to ask them involved retrospective behavior. Now, there are some problems with it. I kind of want to point out to you that not everything about this is perfect. That's okay, because we're going to try to address this the best we can in the statistics. So sometimes you say, well, I don't have a perfect survey. There are problems with the survey, but if you know the problems, recognize the problems, and then you take appropriate steps to deal with those, more often than not, you can overcome these difficulties. So in some cases, the households were asked, in October of 2001, what was your situation? Can you tell us now what is your situation? So who was employed in October? Who's employed now? And there is a recall bias that everybody who studies survey data knows about, but hopefully that won't be a problem that we can't overcome. Here are some of the key variables that we were interested in. Of course, household income is important for any economic study. Employment data, household structure. If we're going to talk about household behavior, of course, we want to know how the households are formed. Is it a single-parent family? Is it a two-parent family with children, two-parent family without children? Two-parent family with children, but some other family member lives there too, those sorts of things. Those are all interesting and important. And those are sort of in between household structure and family characteristics. The age of the children, how many of them go to school, those sorts of things are all important. Now, wealth is a real problem. Anytime you want to study wealth, you can't. This is kind of one of the sort of like fundamental laws of economic analysis, is that nobody really knows how to measure wealth. And even if you did know how to measure wealth, probably you could not get through survey data the information that you need to measure wealth. One of the things that has been done, and the best that we can do, and I think that's actually not a bad approach, is to create an index of wealth based on asset ownership. So this is sort of asset wealth in a peculiar way. We take families and you ask them, for example, do you have indoor plumbing in your house? And the answer is yes or no. If they say yes, then we say, do you have indoor plumbing that's associated with a bathroom in your house? And the answer is either yes or no. And then you can continue that line of reasoning down. And you can imagine that you could identify a sequence of asset ownership that is more or less associated with wealth. Now, it's not perfect, and there are problems with it. So what we've done is we've relied on some previous research that was done using Russian data and some research that was done using other data, where you can construct an index based on a broad measure of different household assets. So do you have a refrigerator? Yes or no. Does the refrigerator have a freezer? Yes or no. Now in the US, of course, what would happen if you tried to construct an index with these sorts of things? Everybody would be the same, right? Everybody has indoor plumbing, everybody has a bathroom, everybody has a flush toilet, everybody has a refrigerator, and every refrigerator has a freezer. So it's very important when constructing this that we have assets where there is variance. So we have to have measures where some people have it and some people don't, in addition to the fact that that asset has to be arguably correlated with wealth. So it has to be an asset that you would conclude, not naturally, that if the family had more access to resources, they would probably acquire this asset. And so we've looked at things like telephones, refrigerators with freezers, flush toilets versus pit toilets, indoor, outdoor toilets, plumbing. Is your house connected to a sewer system, or does it have some other way of dealing with wastewater? Those sorts of things that probably, now again, there's some question here, but probably are associated with increased wealth. And I think there are some interesting issues there, but nothing that we can really get into. Now, economic impact. Let me just tell you about this crisis, just so you'll know. When we asked in this survey, did someone in your household suffer an income loss because of the economic crisis, 41% of households said that that was something that hit them personally. So that's a pretty broad thing. So think about your family. Has your family suffered an income loss in the last 6 months? And probably most of you would say, well, probably not. What about employment loss? 10% of households, almost, 9.1% of households, directly suffered an employment loss over the last 6 months, of 6 months preceding the survey. Salaries paid in bonds, and this one requires some explanation. Argentina has this interesting problem that the federal government doesn't always give the state and local governments enough money to fund their programs. So instead of paying people in cash because they don't have cash, and they can't write out checks because, of course, checks and cash are basically the same thing if they don't have any way of funding people, the provincial governments have resorted to paying people in bonds. Basically what it is, it's a promise by your provincial government that they will at some point in the future be able to give you cash. So suppose that you worked for the school district. That's maybe a common example in Argentina. The school district relies on the state government, in our case, for its funding, and in Argentina it relies on the federal government for its funding. And if the federal government didn't come through with its funding, you still have to pay the teachers. Well, you don't have any way of paying the teachers, so you give them bonds. Pay them literally with promises of future payment. What's amazing is that in Argentina, at the time of the survey, 18.6% of salaries were paid in bonds. That's a significant amount. And it's not just some here, some there. It's almost a fifth of all salaries nationwide were paid in bonds. And here's a brief digression. We're not going to talk about this much more. I just wanted to introduce this. This is something that we are working on next. Our next line of research is to look at banking restrictions. But I want to make you aware of that. The ones with stars are things that I'm actually going to talk about in the analysis part. But banking restrictions are very important, and I will work on that in the future. 10% of households report having some or all of their assets frozen because of the banking restrictions. But 30% of households report significant costs associated with having to wait in line. That's amazing. 30% of the households, this is an important issue to them. Going to the bank and waiting in line at the bank makes sort of their list of problems they have to deal with day to day. Almost 30% report being inconvenienced by not having enough cash. And I don't really know what that means. We've talked to the survey people and asked them to be a little more specific next time, because there are different ways that you could be inconvenienced by lack of cash. For example, if I were wanting to buy something and I didn't have access to my banking account, I didn't have any cash, I guess that would be inconvenient. But also if I were a merchant, I would be inconvenienced by not having enough cash to make change, or that my clients don't have enough cash. So that's not really a very good measure, this inconvenience by lack of cash, and hopefully in the future we'll get better measures of what that really means. But it's an important problem. The lack of cash in the economy has caused problems for many people. Finally, 17.7% of households report being the victim of a violent or property crime in the last 6 months. I look at that and I say, you know, I take that with a grain of salt, right, because I'm not really sure without some identification issues there what that really means. But the fact that 18% of households report not that crime is a problem. So you can say, well, is crime a problem? Yes, crime's a problem. Everybody thinks that's a problem. But 18% of households say that they have been affected directly by crime. And I think that's another thing that we're interested in talking about, but have not yet at this point been able to finish. So we'll talk about it at some future time. Well, here are the coping strategies. In the survey, we've asked people all sorts of things. What do you do, or what have you done to deal with the fact that you have economic problems? 74% of households report reducing their consumption of food. And when I saw this, I just about fell off my chair, because I was like, there's no way. Because you would think of all of the different ways you could deal with the economic crisis, probably eating less would be last on my list. That would be the one that I would be, you know, I would give that up when they pry my fingers from around it, right? I would say, I'll do anything, but I'm not going to go on some sort of economic diet, right? So, but 74% of households report this as being one way that they have dealt with the crisis. Of course, 93%, and this one I believe, substituted towards purchase of cheaper food. So virtually every household has had the way they live on a daily basis affected by economic crisis. 93% say that they've had to change their purchasing patterns to take advantage of cheaper forms of food. 81% report reducing their non-food consumption. And again, this is a broad-based measure. I'm not really sure what to tell you that means, but when people were asked, have you reduced your consumption of goods besides food, 81% report that as being important as well. 83% report substituting towards cheaper non-food goods. Here's a surprising one to me. 37% of households say that during the last 6 months they have not purchased needed medicines. So when they were asking, did this happen to you, did this happen to you, did you have a medical need, in other words, pharmaceuticals or medicines, that went unfulfilled because you were not able to purchase the medicines? That happened to 37% of households. Substitute to cheaper forms of transportation, 60%, and this was asked as a series of questions, and we've kind of aggregated this all together. People who used to drive their cars are now taking the bus. People who used to take the bus are now riding their bicycles. And people who used to ride their bicycles are now walking. All of those things are higher. So this is overall, this is all households, whether or not they were individually impacted by the economic crisis. Here's another set of coping strategies which we call active coping strategies. These are gauged over the last 6 months. Have you engaged in home production of food for consumption? 61% of households report beginning to produce food at home. So this isn't 61% are now producing food at home. This is 61% who have now started. So this is 61% of households that didn't used to do it that are now doing it. 15% report home production of goods for sale, manufacturing things at home for sale in the marketplace. 7% report moving to another province. So that's a significant distance if you could imagine what the provinces are like. 3% report having to sell or pawn their belongings in order to stay alive. 12% report living off savings. So I think some of these numbers might be small, but if you think about it, sell or pawn belongings, that might be restricted by the fact that a lot of these families don't have anything that could be sold or pawned. So I think that's a significant indicator there as well. 13% of families added a new worker to the labor market, which is kind of interesting because it's not clear at all that those new workers in the labor market were actually able to find employment. So significant problems here. Of those who were employed, 15% report working more hours in their current employment. That's one way of dealing with the crisis, is to seek extra pay, overtime pay, extra jobs, those sorts of things. So clearly there's something going on here. Finally, we want to talk about social network strategies, things that you rely on your society to provide. 8% report receiving or beginning to receive, I have to be careful because there's a difference there, 8% report beginning to rely on friends or family for economic support. So again, it's this sort of beginning problem that's makes the problem a lot worse, I think. 4% report beginning to receive public assistance, where public assistance includes government, church, and not-for-profits. 9% report beginning to engage in barter economy. Yes, question?
Well, just in connection with that, receive public assistance, how are they able to do that if they can't even pay their school teachers, like with the bonds?
Yeah, and we don't know because it's lumping together government, church, and not-for-profit. So we don't know how much of that's government, how much of that's religious, how much of it's not-for-profit or NGO. So we don't really know, but I think a lot of it has to do with sort of non-governmental agencies providing an increased amount of support. That's not a big number, but it is a big number when you consider that a lot of those families were already receiving public assistance. We have a 4% increase. Communal activities, and we've kind of lumped these together. There are lots. This is the big thing in Argentina recently, is to band together as a neighborhood to solve our problems. School meal programs, communal purchase, participating in what they call American fairs, which are where you go to, you take things that you don't need anymore, and you take them to the American fair, and then other people will have brought things that they don't need anymore, and then you kind of exchange. So it's kind of a bartering of used goods market. These things have become very popular. 6% report an increased or a new participation in communal activities where that wasn't so popular before. So what's our initial observation? So this is just kind of the rough cut. What have we learned already? Well, it's apparent that the effects of the economic crisis are widespread. And this is a crisis that has hit a broad range of households in a lot of different ways. Many households were impacted directly in one or more ways. In fact, I would say virtually every household in one or more ways has been impacted. Virtually all households report beginning to use one or more of the coping strategies that we've identified over the period being studied. So this isn't something that is only affecting a certain part of the society. It's not just affecting the very poor. It's not affecting just the middle class. It's not affecting the wealthy. It's pretty much affecting everybody. So we're interested in finding out how, more specifically, this is mattering. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to study how, when a household has a specific crisis, how that affects their behavior. So it's kind of a complicated table here, but let me just explain how these next three tables are all the same. So if I explain it once, I should be able to get some mileage out of it. So here on this column, we've listed the coping strategies. For example, reduced food consumption. And then we have three different types of shocks. Did your household experience an income loss? Did they experience an employment loss? Were they paid in bonds versus having cash salary? Or was there no shock? So of the houses that had no shock, 68% report reducing their food consumption, which is kind of remarkable. But look at those who had an employment loss and how much bigger the effect or the impact was on those who lost their job. So we see a direct correlation here between suffering an employment loss and an increased probability or increased reliance on reducing food consumption as a way of dealing with the economic crisis. Paid-in bonds and income loss are also more prevalent among, or this strategy is also more prevalent among those who had income loss and who were paid in bonds than those who had no shock. So maybe kind of just to recap, here's our control group. This is how the economic crisis generally affected all households. These are specific. So these are our treatment effects. So if you have a household that had an employment loss, in what way are they different than a household that had no employment loss but still is constrained to live in the country? And what you see as you look down this column is an employment loss in every case, so comparing 76 to 51, 90 to 79, 90 to 77, 97, 88, and so on, an employment loss has led to an increased reliance on these coping strategies. So when a family has an employment loss, and I don't think this is surprising now, It was surprising to me when I first saw it. I thought, hey, something's not right here, because I would have expected families to prioritize, to say, what should we do first? What's our first line of defense? Well, our first line of defense is maybe cheaper transportation. What's our second line of defense? If that's not enough to balance our budget, then what do? Well, we substitute to cheaper non-food goods, and so on. And so I expected sort of like this sequencing of priorities. But the data don't really support that. The data show that pretty much an employment loss is a big enough impact that you increase your reliance on virtually every strategy that's available to you. That's an important thing here. Another important thing to notice is that paid-in bonds actually has an effect. Now, some people in Argentina argue this should have no effect, because if this provincial government gives you a bond, then those bonds circulate in the economy just like cash. How many of you have been to a country where they have bonds and cash both in the same economy? And did you notice that they more or less just circulate like cash?
Yeah, well, I was actually Argentina. In Buenos Aires, they wouldn't normally take. Some places would.
Some places wouldn't. Yes, they didn't like it, and they really said, "Hey, do you have cash? I'd really rather have cash," and so on. But they do circulate like cash, and this is the government's official line: is there should be no effect, right? Because we'll give these bonds out. Eventually, every merchant will accept them, because those merchants who don't will find themselves out of business, blah, 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 and the usual story. But what we're saying is that when a family gets paid in bonds, that has almost the same impact. If you compare bond payment to income loss, it's just like you paid them less. So being paid in bonds is not like not having a job. It's better than not having a job, but it's like being paid less. So there is this significant and real effect that no one has ever predicted, and in fact I don't think anyone has ever measured, because this concept is so new in Argentina that really we're just now starting to see data and surveys like this to explain this. So these are the adaptive strategies. Let's look at these active strategies. The same patterns, not surprising. I mean, like some people say, oh, this is a little surprising. It's not. Exact same patterns. You see the control group over here, no shock. Now, I guess the one anomaly here is that migration, paid-in bonds, people who are paid in bonds are not any more likely to have migrated than those who have no shock. But then you think about it, well, of course, they have a job, right? Who's going to leave town? Yeah, you're getting paid in bonds, but still, you're being paid. That's better than no job. But you see significantly higher rates of coping strategies among those who have lost employment. You see income loss and bond payment more or less identical for most of these categories, and very similar, 16.0, 16.1, 19, 22, very similar sorts of things. Now, the other important thing to notice here is that there is almost no coping strategy where that isn't used. So it's kind of a unique, to me, a unique sociological lesson is that people don't behave as I predicted they would, which is sort of to prioritize and sequence. They take advantage of every coping strategy that's available to them. All of them have a positive effect. Finally, social network strategies, and there are fewer of these here to report, but again, significantly large effect, especially by employment loss. Compare those who have an employment loss, who are now 19% of those report having to go back to their friends or family and ask for support, versus 5% who didn't have an employment loss. That's a huge difference. All of these differences are very large, and again, the same pattern that you see income shock and paid-in bonds having almost the same effect, although maybe paid-in bonds is a little less here. Okay, so what do we learn about this? These are what I'll call intermediate conclusions. First of all, households that have had specific economic shocks are more likely to have employed coping strategies than those with no shocks. In other words, there is something going on here. The effects of the employment shocks are generally observed to be larger than the other shocks. Employment is probably, observably, the worst thing that has happened to households, or unemployment versus income loss or being paid in bonds. And it's by far the most drastic measure here. And I think the important lesson to me is that bond payments are similar to income losses. So the official line about, well, we'll just pay them in bonds because cash is really a bond anyway, and it all really doesn't matter, is not true. Certainly not in behavioral sense. One thing I would point out is that these results are simply just tabulations. There's nothing here to control for any of these statistical problems mentioned earlier, especially confounding influences. So what we want to do is take a little sophisticated approach. Since we do know something about statistics, we should probably take advantage of that. So we're going to use a multivariate regression framework. It's not anything to be scared of. It's just a straightforward way of looking at the problem. And we have 17 different logit regression equation. So, yeah, it's not just your kindergarten problem, but it's not that bad either. It takes a couple of days to analyze this, but it's not a big deal. One of the things that we're going to be most concerned about is that we also know that the use of coping strategies will depend on family structure. We know, because we've observed this before, that family size and structure, the presence of children, a female head of house, age and education of the head of house, household wealth, all of these things matter. For whatever reason, they do matter, and so we need to account for that and control for that. So here's what happens when you do this, and I'll be brief on this. There's a lot more. If you're familiar with logit regressions, great. There's a lot of stuff for here to see. But I want to just focus on one set of results, these marginal effects. The mean over here is the population average. So reduced food consumption was observed in 77% of families. The marginal effect tells how much this number would go if the household had income loss. That's how you interpret the marginal effect. So it was 7% to 84%. To the tables that we used before, the math in your head. So other than one of the things that you notice here is that even after we control for all of these things that matter, household structure, education, wealth, all of their stuff, all of these effects are there. Some of them are statistically significant. Migration, for example, the very effect, 0.1% on 5.5%. There, and they are all positive. And sometimes, friends, you want to look at the set of results and just what can I learn from the set of results collectively? What can we learn? That income loss is a problem that affects households. And how do they react to that? They react to that in a full, varied approach. They react in different ways to this income. Look at employment effects. Now, you're guessing the employment effects to be larger than the income effects. Well, let's take a look. And more or less, you're right. So if you look at these effects, compare them to the income loss effects. In fact, some of these are very large. 13% increase on 61% increase. So that would go from 62 to about 75%. That's a very large effect on substituting to cheaper transportation. Some of these are not as large. For example, migration again. It's only 0.4 on 5.5%. Some of them are actually negative. Adding a new worker to the labor market. Now this is the one that's negative. So whenever I look at the big picture, whoa, what's going on there? Something interesting, right? And then this is where your brain has to work. You have to say to yourself, why would it be that in a household that had an employment loss, it's less likely that they added a new worker to the labor market? Because they got a guy that just lost his job, right? And so does that make sense? And the answer is yes. Of course, it makes eminent sense. And we should not be surprised at that. Because sometimes we're hung up on the fact, oh, look, they're not all positive. Well, does that make sense for that one to be negative? And in fact, it does. What's amazing is that this we didn't observe before. When we didn't control for other things like wealth and family structure, this effect was not there. We couldn't observe it. And now we actually know what's happening here. So instead of, of those families where one of them lost a job, instead of 9% of them sending someone else to work, it's only about 3%. Why? Well, someone just lost their job. How are you going to replace them? Presumably, everybody else was already working anyway, and this guy can't find a job. That's why he doesn't work. So there's not a lot of opportunity there. Let's look at the last set of results here. These are the bond payment effects. One of the things that does start to happen here, and I think this is kind of unfortunate because we had such a good story going here, when you control for other things, you see that the big picture isn't quite as strong as it was before. So I could point to income loss and just say, look, they're all positive. Almost all of them are statistically significant. What's going on here? Well, they're mostly positive, and when they're not positive, they're small, right? But then there's a lot of problem over here with statistical significance. You see a lot of these results not being robust in the sense that they're kind of fragile. They kind of vary a little bit. So we're not so convinced that this result is actually as strong as it was before. But in some cases, you get some really surprising results. That bond payments has in particular affected people's ability to buy non-essential goods. That's one of the ways that that's most importantly impacted by bond payments is by your substitution towards cheaper non-food goods and substitution towards cheaper transportation. When we look at that, we wonder, though, is that because they are economizing, in other words, that they are trying to do more with less, or is it because the bus company won't take your bonds, and so you have to ride your bike? Or is it because the clothing store won't accept your bonds, so you can't buy clothing, so you have to shop at other places that do, and so you end up buying things a little bit cheaper? Well, that's all fine and good, but there's something fundamental going on here that I skipped over that I do want to come back to briefly. I said that family composition matters, and it might be interesting for you to see how this matters, because it shouldn't, right? You say, well, if it's sort of a fundamental behavior of households, it should be the same. Well, let's take a look. It turns out that households that are single-parent households react differently than households that have two parents. Single-parent households are more likely to not purchase needed medicine. Why would that be the case? Well, let's think about it. Well, I don't know. that's what we thought. Well, that doesn't make sense, right? Why would that be the case? And the answer is we really don't know. So we're saying, well, okay, that's interesting. That's good. That's a starting point for future research. Single-parent households are more likely to have migrated. Now, that kind of makes sense, right? Because you've only got one adult, some children. It's probably easier to migrate with a single-parent household. They're more likely to sell or pawn belongings. They're more likely to live off savings. And, of course, they're more likely to receive public assistance. Most of those things make sense. But even if they didn't, in the case of not purchasing needed medicine, we've observed something that we can follow up on our research. We've raised more questions. Single-parent households are less likely to engage in home production of food. And I think that, in fact, does have a logical explanation, because home production of food is something that's done by adults, and single-parent households kind of by definition have fewer adults than two-parent households, so there are less people around to do the work, and that makes sense as well. What about female heads of house? Sometimes we run a risk of saying, well, you know, moms and dads are different. I do fundamentally believe that moms and dads behave differently, and that I don't have to look farther than my own home to observe that I know that in lots of ways moms and dads behave differently. So what if you have a female head of house, a house that's run by a woman instead of a man? They are more likely to reduce food. They're more likely to be industrious, produce home food and goods for sale. Does that square with your preconceived notion about female heads of house? I don't know, because I don't know what you'd expect here. But female heads of house are less likely to sell or pawn belongings and less likely to live off savings. Now, again, sometimes we say, well, this is interesting, and I understand why this is the case. Here's something that I would say, this is interesting. I don't know why this would be the case. Let's find out. Let's do some further follow-up studies and see if we can figure out why female heads of house behave differently. There may be logical explanations, but there may not be. It may be something that we need to work on. I'm going to have to go a little bit quickly because we're going to run out of time and not get to answer any questions. Just so you'll know, larger families are more likely to rely on cheaper transportation, migrate, send people to work. No surprise there, right? Larger families send people to work, okay. Work more hours, public assistance, communal activities. All of these things, I think, are activities that have bigger returns to larger families or are easier to participate in. They're less likely to sell or pawn belongings. I would argue that's because they probably have per capita fewer belongings to pawn or sell. That's usually what I would predict. The final one is that more educated households, so in other words, where the primary parent, I don't even know what that means, but we use that term in survey methodology all the time, the primary parent is more educated, they are less likely to engage in all coping strategies. The more educated the parents are, the less likely the family is to have engaged in coping strategies, except one set, social network. So it seems to be something among the educated class to avoid reducing your consumption, to avoid changing your economic behavior, but to go back to your friends and family and rely on them for help. Probably it's because if you were educated, so if you think about this, you're all highly educated, and would certainly be really highly educated in Argentina. It's probably the way that you got to be educated was that your family had resources to begin with. So there is something to go back there too. I think there are a few of you who are students who couldn't go back and live at home now if something bad happened. I think most students probably could do that. And that's because there is something to go back to. And maybe that's what's going on here, is that educated families have educated parents, have educated siblings, have other people to rely on who have resources. Finally, does wealth matter? When we compare the lowest third of wealth to the highest third, and again, not that our wealth measure is great, but we should be able to chop people up into lowest third, highest third. That's kind of the simplest distinction that you could make. What you find out is that the wealthiest third, look what they are going to do. They're going to not reduce their food consumption. That's what I would have predicted. But they're more likely to sell and pawn belongings. Why? Because they have them, right? Obvious, okay. Rely on family or friends. And why are they more likely to do that? Because wealthy people tend to know other wealthy people. So wealthy children tend to be from wealthy parents. So they have people that they can go rely on. But we also know that the wealthiest third are less likely to send new workers in the case of employment loss. Now, why is that? Well, how did they get to be wealthy? Everybody's working, right? One of the tendencies in Argentina is the way to become wealthy is to have both parents work. So if both parents have good, stable employment, one of them loses their job, you don't have anybody to send into the workforce. And so again, I think this is telltale about how wealth affects not our behavior, but it affects our standing, I guess, pre-crisis standing. Is that the right word? I don't know. Finally, I think this is our conclusion, is the wealthiest third probably have greater access to resources, especially through family and friends. And so they're going to react very differently in an economic crisis than the least wealthy families. So to summarize, the economic crisis in Argentina has had a far-reaching impact. It's impacted virtually every household, poor, wealthy, middle class, otherwise, that everybody's been impacted. Most Argentine families report reacting in some way. Those who are most directly affected by the economic shocks are most likely to have engaged in a broad range of economic coping strategies. The effect of being paid in bonds, and I think this is an important lesson for public policy, that bond payment is not a costless way out of a problem, because paying your workers in bonds has an effect that's similar to reduced income. Family size and structure do matter, and I think that's more or less a starting point for future research. At least that's how we're treating it. And finally, wealth matters in some cases, but probably less than you would predict. That the impact of wealth, yes, it does matter, but it's not like the wealthy were spared from economic crisis more or less than the poor. It appears that everybody was impacted the same. Great. So I think we have about 3 to 5 minutes, it looks like. I understand people are going to have to get up and leave when you have to get up and leave, and that's fine. But if you'd like to ask questions, now would be a good time. Remember, you have to wait for the microphone.
Can you put the last slide back up?
I can try. Yeah, I can. There we go. I can't do it with this, but I can do it that way. All right.
So why did some of the families that weren't affected by the economic crisis, why did they reduce their spending and start engaging in coping activities? Do you know that?
That's an interesting question. I think a lot of it has to do with the difference between being directly impacted and indirectly impacted. So direct impact is that something happened dramatic in your household, whereas indirectly is, well, maybe you were the victim of strikes or other general disruptions in the economy. I have friends, of course, who were impacted and friends who weren't, and my impression is that those who were not impacted reacted for two reasons. One, because there was something else going on that limited their ability to do what they wanted to do, and the other reason is that they were a little more cautious because they think they may be impacted, and so they're going to sort of save up, kind of the grasshopper and the ant. They're engaging in what we call ant-like behavior because they see that the winter is coming and maybe they'll be next. We have to wait for the microphone to get over.
Did this study include the hordes of, in any way, the hordes of homeless people that have gone to the streets?
Yes, that was one of the things that they were very careful to make sure that they included the villas as part of their studies. Now, I think Argentina homeless is a little bit different than what we think of in the U.S. There aren't in parks. That's not allowed. But it's perfectly fine to live in a cardboard box in a designated area. So, I mean, it's not quite the same, but yes, definitely there were people, and you can tell when we look down the address list of those that were randomly selected. You see, third place from the entrance, and that that's like, okay, that's pretty much somebody who's living in a shanty or some sort of precarious structure. We also asked them about the type of house they live in, and you can see in the survey. House made of, and there's the choice of listing scrap metal, cardboard, scrap wood, cinder blocks, and it goes right on up to, of course, first-class construction. But yeah, it has everybody in there. Did they answer the questions right? I don't know. That's another. It's always an interesting question about surveys: is did the people actually give you honest answers? But they were surveyed. Okay, up here.
What effect did remittances from the U.S. play in the household economy?
You know, I'm not exactly sure because I don't know how the U.S. in particular what form their aid has taken place. What I am aware of course, because I'm working with World Bank people, is that World Bank funding has been focused at poverty relief. So they've been focusing on providing public assistance, specifically in the form of medications or food. So that's really hard to tell. In fact, that's one of the reasons why they wanted to do this study, was to justify their continued funding of medication and food policy in Argentina. Some of you are aware, of course, that the World Bank is generally associated with developing countries. Most people would not put Argentina in the category of developing. It's sort of developed or semi-developed country. It'd be kind of higher on the food chain. So why is the World Bank worrying about it? And this is part of the justification, is they're seeing an economic crisis where people are not getting medicines that they need. People are not getting, especially children, are not getting the foods that they need to maintain their health and to move on. So that's the U.S. remittances. I don't know. World Bank, that's kind of what we're expecting, is this is going to be more a result of this survey than kind of an impetus for the survey. Okay, any other questions? Looks like the bell is ringing, so we're going to let everyone go.